There is a very popular belief in the modern world that says the following: if you want to be valued, you need to always be present, always available, always responding quickly, always showing interest. But the truth is, this idea may be destroying your power without you even realizing it, because in real human nature, something strange happens. The more you chase after them, the less people miss you. And that's not just an opinion. It's a psychological pattern that strategists have understood for centuries. Machiavelli, one of the greatest observers of human behavior, already explained that influence does not arise from constant presence. It arises from the perception of value. And value is rarely found in what is always available. Think of someone you respect very much. This person is constantly trying to get attention. Or does it seem to have a calm, selective, almost mysterious presence? So it is. There is a type of power that doesn't need to shout, doesn't need to beg for attention, and doesn't need to convince anyone of anything. It is silent power, the kind of power that makes people think about you even when you're not around. The kind of power that makes one wonder, why didn't that person simply react? Today, you will understand exactly how this mechanism works. And even more importantly, how to develop this strategic approach without cheap manipulation, without childish games, and without having to change who you are. Because when someone learns to master this art, something curious happens. People not only respect this presence more, they are starting to miss her, and that completely changes the game. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. There is a type of power that makes no noise. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't chase after anyone. It doesn't try to prove anything to anyone. It's the kind of power Machiavelli observed in the most astute leaders in history. Men who understood that true influence is born from politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Think for a moment. Who seems more powerful? The man who insists, explains, justifies, and begs for attention, or the one who remains silent while everyone tries to decipher what he's thinking? That's right. Silence, when used intelligently, functions as a kind of invisible language. It says much more than 1,000 words. When someone understands that the end justifies the means, they also realize that reacting isn't always the best move. Often, the absence of reaction is the most strategic move on the board. It's like in a game of chess. The experienced player doesn't move pieces impulsively. He observes, calculates, waits, and then acts at the right moment with calculated use of force. Silence works exactly like that. It creates mystery, generates respect, and prevents other people from easily accessing your emotions. And when people can't read you, something curious happens. They start observing you more closely. Now consider something curious about human nature. When someone is always available, always responding, always trying to explain themselves, that person quickly loses value. Not because they are weak, but because the human mind interprets constant availability as something commonplace. Machiavelli said that a leader should always maintain an appearance of virtue, but without completely revealing their intentions. In other words, show presence, but never total transparency. Imagine a man in a work conversation or even in a relationship. When someone provokes him, they expect him to react immediately, perhaps with irritation, perhaps with defensiveness. But the man who understands the game of influence does something different. He simply remains silent. He doesn't respond immediately. He doesn't justify himself. He doesn't rush, and this completely changes the dynamics of the interaction. Suddenly, the one who provoked begins to feel discomfort. The human brain doesn't like gaps. It wants answers. It wants a reaction. It wants confirmation. When this doesn't happen, something powerful arises, curiosity mixed with tension. And at that moment, without saying a word, the person who remains silent assumes a position of advantage, because whoever controls the reaction controls the game. There's also a strategic aspect to all this that few realize. Many men believe that power means dominating through speech, confrontation, and public displays of strength. But ancient strategists understood something different. True power lies in constant adaptability, in the ability to choose when to act and when not to act. Sometimes silence is not the absence of action, it's preparation. Think of great leaders or investors. Many of them spend more time observing than speaking. They know that decisions based on real human nature are far more effective than impulsive decisions. The same applies to social relationships. When someone learns to master silence, they begin to act like a commander who possesses his own loyal armies within his own mind. Discipline, self-control, and strategy. He doesn't react to every provocation, doesn't respond to every message in the same minute, doesn't chase after those who distance themselves. On the contrary, he understands that virtù and fortuna go hand in hand. Strategic skill combined with the right moment. And curiously, when someone masters this art, they begin to notice something intriguing. People begin to feel their absence more than they felt their presence. And this opens the door to something even deeper, understanding what goes on inside the mind of someone who is ignored. There's something curious about the human brain that few realize. Being ignored hurts. It's not just a metaphor, it's not emotional exaggeration. Neuroscience studies show that social rejection activates the same brain regions associated with physical pain. In other words, when someone is ignored, the brain interprets it almost as an injury. And that's precisely why the strategy of silence is so powerful. Machiavelli, always attentive to real human nature, understood that men are not driven solely by logic, but by deep emotions such as pride, insecurity, and the need for recognition. When someone expects a response and doesn't receive it, something begins to happen inside that person's mind. Their thoughts go into a loop. They start to wonder what they did wrong, if they said something inappropriate, if they lost value in the eyes of the other person. This psychological process is powerful because it transforms silence into a kind of invisible mirror. And the more someone tries to understand the reason for the lack of reaction, the more mental energy that person invests in the one who remained silent. Notice the paradox. Those who speak less often occupy more space in the minds of others. Now imagine a simple everyday situation. A co-worker criticizes you in front of other people, expecting some kind of reaction, perhaps a defense, perhaps an argument. Most people react immediately, trying to justify, explain, rebut. But the strategist does something different. He listens, observes, and simply doesn't react at that moment. He doesn't argue. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't try to convince anyone. He lets silence fill the space. And here something fascinating happens. The critic begins to feel a kind of invisible discomfort, because the natural expectation was confrontation. When that reaction doesn't come, doubt arises, insecurity arises. That uncomfortable feeling of, did I say too much, arises. This type of posture reflects something Machiavelli always emphasized: avoiding being hated, but also avoiding appearing weak. Well-applied silence is not submission, It's the calculated use of force. It shows self-control. It shows discipline. It shows that the person doesn't react impulsively. And in the world of human relations, those who control their own emotions tend to seem more powerful than those who try to control others. But there's an even deeper detail to all this. When someone is ignored, the mind tries to fill the void with interpretations. And these interpretations are rarely neutral. Most of the time, they amplify the value of the one who is silent. It's as if the brain thinks if this person didn't react, maybe they don't need to prove anything. And this is a central point of strategy. Machiavelli said that true power is born from the combination of virtù and fortuna, skill and opportune moment. Knowing when not to react is a form of virtù, a mental discipline that few possess. Think of business leaders, investors, or political strategists. Many of them master this skill. They speak little, observe much, and let others reveal their own intentions. They know that decisions based on emotional impulses are rarely intelligent decisions. Therefore, while many live trying to be heard all the time, strategists learn something different. Those who don't chase after what they want are often the ones who are most sought after. And this perception naturally leads to another fundamental principle of social strategy, the art of strategic retreat. There's a huge difference between disappearing out of weakness and withdrawing strategically. Most people don't understand this. When someone withdraws, others often interpret it as giving up, insecurity, or defeat. But the great strategists of history saw withdrawal in a completely different way. Machiavelli observed that truly intelligent leaders knew how to choose their battles because they deeply understood politics guided by reality, not by ideals. They didn't react to every provocation. They didn't get involved in every conflict. And above all, they didn't waste energy trying to convince those who had already decided not to understand. Instead, they retreated, observed, and returned when the moment was favorable. This is not weakness. This is strategy. It's like a chess player removing a seemingly important piece to rearrange the board. To those who don't understand the game, it seems like a loss, but to those who see several moves ahead, it's just preparation. And this skill requires something rare: constant adaptability. The ability to change position without losing control of the game. Now imagine a situation that frequently occurs in human relationships. Someone starts treating you with disrespect, perhaps a coworker, perhaps a friend, perhaps even someone in a romantic relationship. The common reaction is to confront immediately, try to resolve it right away, argue, explain, demand change. But often this only fuels the conflict. The strategist acts differently. They reduce exposure. They decrease availability. They remain present in the environment, but emotionally become unreachable. They respond less, get less involved, and observe more. It's not revenge, nor childish manipulation. It's the calculated use of force. Because by becoming less predictable, they completely alter the dynamics of the relationship. Suddenly, the person who previously felt comfortable disrespecting begins to notice something strange. That person no longer reacts the same way. They no longer seek approval. They no longer try to please. And this generates a powerful effect on the human mind. Respect, which previously seemed non-existent, begins to emerge naturally. Not because it was demanded, but because it was demonstrated through behavior. This is a point that Machiavelli understood clearly when discussing leadership and influence. An effective ruler needed to preserve their image, maintaining an appearance of virtue, but also demonstrating firmness when necessary. They needed to avoid public humiliation while simultaneously avoiding being hated. Strategic withdrawal fulfills exactly this role. It prevents you from engaging in pointless battles while keeping your dignity intact. Think of great entrepreneurs, leaders, or strategists. Many of them master the art of disappearing from conflict before it turns into burnout. They know that energy is a limited resource. Therefore, they carefully choose where to invest their attention. This happens because effective decisions are always based on real human nature, not emotional impulses. And when someone begins to master this skill of being present but inaccessible when necessary, something interesting happens. People begin to realize that not everyone deserves access to their energy. And this realization leads to an essential question: who truly deserves your silence? There's a common mistake many people make when they begin to understand the power of silence. They believe they should apply it to everyone. But that would be a strategic error. Machiavelli taught that effective decisions need to be made based on real human nature, not on idealistic principles that ignore the complexity of human relationships. Not everyone deserves the same energy, the same access, or the same reaction. In fact, one of the smartest ways to protect your peace and personal power is to learn to classify the people around you, not arrogantly, but clearly. In simple terms, most human interactions can be divided into three groups: enemies, critics, and energy vampires. Each requires a different approach. The mistake most people make is reacting the same way to everyone. They argue with enemies, try to convince critics, and even wear themselves out emotionally, trying to save those who constantly drain their energy. The strategist does the opposite. They observe people's behavior and consciously decide how much access each person will have. This isn't coldness, it's the calculated use of force and constant adaptability in human relationships. Let's start with the first group, the declared enemies. These are the people who clearly want your downfall, your failure, or your emotional destabilization. Arguing with them rarely brings any benefit. Machiavelli said that an intelligent leader needs to understand when to confront and when to simply deny the opponent's importance. Often the most effective way to deal with an enemy is not to defeat them in public. It's to deny them the importance they desire. Imagine someone who constantly tries to provoke you on social media, in work meetings, or even in social circles. This person expects a reaction because reaction means attention. When you respond, argue, or try to defend yourself all the time, you end up playing exactly the game they wanted to create. The strategist does things differently. They reduce interaction to the bare minimum. They don't fuel pointless arguments. They maintain composure, maintain presence, and remain silent when necessary. This conveys something very powerful: inner security. It's the silent demonstration that that person doesn't control their emotions. And in the game of influence, those who control their own reaction often seem much stronger than those who try to control others. The second and third groups require even more discernment. Critics are not always enemies. Sometimes they are people who simply disagree, point out flaws, or challenge your ideas. Here comes an important principle of strategy: listening intelligently. A strategist knows that useful criticism can be a tool for growth. Great leaders, investors, and thinkers have always learned from intelligent criticism. But there is also the third group, the energy vampires. These are people who constantly complain, criticize everything, drain enthusiasm, and try to drag others down. With them, silence is a form of emotional protection. It's not about hostility, but about boundaries. Machiavelli understood that those who wish to maintain authority need to avoid being hated, but also need to avoid constant wear and tear from unnecessary conflicts. This is where the balance between virtù and fortuna comes in, the ability to deal with people and the wisdom to choose battles. When someone begins to master this ability to filter who deserves attention, something powerful happens. The energy that was previously wasted on useless conflicts begins to transform into inner discipline. And this discipline naturally leads to the next essential principle of personal strategy, the discipline of indifference. There's a skill that separates ordinary people from true strategists, the ability to not react emotionally to everything. It sounds simple when said like that, but in practice, it's one of the most difficult disciplines anyone can develop. Human beings are programmed to respond to provocations, criticism, and rejection almost automatically. Just let someone raise their voice, question your competence, or try to diminish your value, and immediately that urge to respond, explain, or defend yourself arises. But that's exactly where most people lose the game. Machiavelli, in analyzing leaders and rulers, understood that real power requires emotional control. A leader who reacts impulsively becomes predictable, and predictability is a weakness in any competitive environment. Therefore, one of the central skills of personal strategy is learning to build a kind of emotional shield. It doesn't mean ceasing to feel, but learning not to allow anyone access to your emotional state. This requires practice, awareness, and discipline, something the Stoics also advocated centuries ago. Stoic philosophers taught something extremely powerful. Most of what disturbs people is not the events themselves, but the interpretation we make of them. Epictetus, for example, said that the wise man learns to separate what he can control from what he cannot. This principle connects perfectly with Machiavelli's concept of virtù, the ability to act intelligently and with self-control in the face of life's circumstances. Imagine a simple situation. Someone criticizes your work or makes a provocative comment in public. The impulsive reaction would be to respond immediately, perhaps even emotionally. But the strategist trains something different. He breathes, observes, and consciously chooses his reaction. Sometimes he responds calmly, sometimes he simply ignores, and in other situations, he lets silence do the work. This type of posture communicates something extremely powerful without needing to say a word: inner control. And when someone demonstrates emotional control, they convey an image of stability and strength. It's as if they were silently saying, "My emotions are not available for manipulation." But this discipline doesn't arise from nothing. It needs to be trained like a mental muscle. A simple practice is to start observing your own reactions throughout the day. When someone provokes you at work, at home, or even on social media, conduct a small experiment. Wait a few minutes before responding. Observe how your mind reacts. Often, what seemed urgent or offensive loses its power when you create space between the stimulus and the response. This space is precisely where strategic power is born. Machiavelli understood that effective decisions need to be made based on real human nature, not on emotional impulses or romantic ideals about human behavior. That's why he argued that a leader always needs to maintain constant adaptability, reacting differently depending on the situation. And when someone begins to master this discipline of indifference, they notice something curious. Many social disputes are not won by whoever speaks the loudest, but by whoever shows they care the least. And this leads us directly to an even deeper principle about influence and strategy in human relations: the invisible power dynamics in the social chess game. There's an unspoken rule in human relationships that's rarely taught directly. Those who appear to need less usually possess more power. This may seem counterintuitive at first, but when we observe real human nature, we realize it happens all the time. Think about negotiations, relationships, corporate environments, or even social circles. Those who seem desperate for approval, attention, or validation automatically lose ground in the game. Machiavelli understood this deeply when analyzing politics and human behavior. He knew that influence isn't just about strength or formal authority, it's about perception. A leader who seems overly dependent on the approval of others quickly loses respect. On the other hand, one who demonstrates emotional independence becomes seen as difficult to manipulate. And in this kind of game, perception is often more powerful than reality. That's why strategists learn early on that social power doesn't come from speaking louder. It comes from controlling one's own position on the board. That's why many social interactions resemble a game of chess more than a simple conversation. Every move, a response, a silence, a strategic retreat, alters the dynamics of the relationship. The problem is that most people play this game without realizing it exists. They respond immediately to messages, try to resolve conflicts in the heat of the moment, and often overexert themselves to maintain the approval of others. The strategist does the opposite. They understand that the end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve their position and peace of mind. This doesn't mean manipulating people maliciously, but understanding that influence requires emotional intelligence. Imagine a salary negotiation, for example. The professional who demonstrates desperation for that job has less negotiating power. The one who demonstrates calm, confidence, and a willingness to back down sends a clear message. They have options. This principle also applies to friendships, partnerships, and even romantic relationships. Those who possess virtù, the strategic skill that Machiavelli so valued, know that sometimes the most powerful move is simply to make no move at all. Now consider something even more interesting on this social chessboard. When someone learns to control their reactions, their availability, and their attention, they begin to operate with an invisible advantage. They don't need to prove their worth all the time. They don't engage in ego battles. They don't try to win every argument. Instead, they carefully choose where to invest their energy. This is the calculated use of force applied to human relationships. It's like a commander who possesses his own loyal armies, discipline, self-control, and strategic clarity, and therefore doesn't need to demonstrate power all the time. Machiavelli emphasized that a leader should always avoid being hated, but also avoid appearing weak. This balance requires emotional intelligence and constant adaptability because each situation demands a different response. And when someone begins to master this social chess game, they realize something almost disconcerting. Often, true power lies not in controlling others, but in controlling how much you truly care about the game. And this reveals a silent danger that imprisons many people without them realizing it, the danger of caring too much. There's a silent trap that ensnares many people throughout their lives, the constant need for approval. At first glance, this seems innocent. After all, every human being wants to be respected, valued, and recognized. The problem arises when this need begins to guide all decisions. When someone starts measuring their own worth by the opinions of others, something dangerous happens. That person surrenders emotional control of their own life to their surrounding environment. Machiavelli, always attentive to true human nature, observed that those who depend too much on public acceptance become vulnerable to manipulation. After all, if someone knows exactly what you need to hear to feel valued, that person also discovers how to control your reactions. And that's how many end up trapped in toxic relationships, exhausting work environments, or social circles that drain energy. Not because they lack intelligence or talent, but because they are trying to please people who will never be satisfied. The constant search for validation becomes an invisible chain. Think about how many decisions throughout life are made simply to avoid criticism. People who don't change careers because they're afraid of their family's opinion. Professionals who accept unfair situations at work so as not to seem difficult. People who stay in relationships that clearly no longer make sense just to avoid social judgment. This behavior creates a dangerous pattern. The more someone tries to please, the more predictable they become. And predictability is the exact opposite of strategic power. Machiavelli taught that a leader needed to understand that it's better to be feared than loved, if it were necessary to choose between the two, not in the literal sense of spreading fear, but in the sense of maintaining authority and respect. Those who try to be loved by everyone inevitably end up giving up their own autonomy. And that's why strategists learn something difficult, but liberating. Pleasing everyone is not a sign of goodness. Often it's a sign of emotional weakness. There's a mental exercise that helps to identify this trap. Imagine that, for an entire week, you decided to stop explaining your decisions to everyone, not arrogantly, but calmly. If someone questions your choice, you simply respond calmly. It was what I thought was best to do. No long justifications, no endless debates. At first, this might seem strange. Some people might even react negatively because they were used to having complete access to your motivations and emotions. But over time, something interesting happens. Respect begins to emerge. Machiavelli would call this an exercise in virtù, the ability to maintain inner firmness in the face of external pressures. When someone learns to care less about constant approval, something powerful happens. The invisible chains begin to break. And at that moment, a new feeling arises, a kind of silent freedom. But this freedom doesn't just come from ceasing to care about everything. It arises when someone begins to build something even more powerful, a presence that seems almost untouchable. There's a curious stage some people reach in life, and when they get there, something completely changes in how they're perceived by the world. Not because they've become more aggressive, more domineering, or louder, but because they've developed a kind of inner sovereignty. This is the moment when someone stops reacting automatically to others' expectations and begins to act according to their own strategic principles. Machiavelli described something similar when talking about rulers who mastered the combination of virtù and fortuna, inner skill coupled with the right moment to act. These people don't need to prove their worth all the time. They don't argue every criticism, they don't engage in every provocation, and they don't chase validation. This creates a curious aura around them. Because they are selective with their attention and energy, they end up becoming more respected. The human mind values what is not always available, and when someone learns to preserve their presence, they begin to transmit something powerful, silent authority. But becoming untouchable doesn't mean becoming cold or distant from the world. That's a common misinterpretation. The true strategist remains cordial, polite, and even generous when necessary. The difference is that they carefully choose where to invest their emotional energy. Machiavelli taught that an effective leader needs to avoid being hated, but also avoid appearing weak. This balance requires something fundamental: discernment. Not everyone deserves constant attention. Not every discussion deserves a response. Not every criticism deserves an explanation. When someone begins to apply this principle, they notice something interesting. Many situations that previously seemed enormous simply lose importance. Small provocations cease to bother. Superficial opinions lose weight. This happens because the person begins to operate based on politics guided by reality, not by ideals. They understand that social life is a strategic environment and that protecting their energy is as important as achieving external results. There's also a practical side to this transformation. Becoming untouchable requires daily discipline. It's not something that happens all at once. A good exercise is to start observing how many times a day you react impulsively to something you could simply ignore. Perhaps a negative comment on social media, perhaps a provocation at work, perhaps unfair criticism in a social circle. Instead of reacting immediately, try applying calculated use of force. Observe, evaluate, and consciously decide if it truly deserves your attention. Over time, this practice creates a profound change in how you position yourself in the world. Machiavelli understood that effective decisions need to be made based on real human nature and require constant adaptability to circumstances. And when someone begins to master this posture, selective, strategic, and emotionally stable, something powerful happens. People begin to realize that that presence is not easy to influence, not easy to manipulate, and not easy to access. And it is precisely at this point that the final movement of this journey arises, the call to power. There comes a point in life when a person begins to realize something uncomfortable, yet profoundly liberating. They realize they've spent years reacting to the world instead of acting strategically within it, reacting to criticism, reacting to expectations, reacting to provocations, reacting to the constant need to prove their worth. And when someone looks at this honestly, an inevitable question arises: who was really controlling the game? Often, without realizing it, we relinquish that control to other people, to external opinions, to social expectations, to the need for acceptance. Machiavelli, observing true human nature, understood that those who wish to build power must first regain control over themselves. No ruler can command a kingdom if they cannot control their own emotions. Similarly, no one can build true respect if they react impulsively to every external stimulus. The first step towards any form of authority, whether personal, social, or professional, begins within one's own mind. This is where something few develop emerges: an inner empire. Not an empire of wealth or immediate status, but of mental discipline. It's the ability to consciously decide where to place your energy, your attention, and your emotions. Think of the great strategists of history. They weren't just intelligent, they were disciplined. They knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to advance and when to retreat, when to confront and when to ignore. This is the true essence of virtue, the concept Machiavelli valued so much: strategic skill applied to real life. A man who masters his mind becomes much harder to manipulate. He doesn't need to please everyone. He doesn't need to win every argument. He doesn't need to prove his worth all the time. He understands that the end justifies the means when the goal is to preserve his autonomy and build something greater. And that's why he makes decisions based on politics guided by reality, not ideals, evaluating people, contexts, and opportunities with clarity, not naivete. Now imagine the impact this can have on your own life. Think about situations where you could react less and observe more, discussions you could simply let die in silence, relationships that perhaps need clearer boundaries. When someone begins to apply these principles, something curious happens. The world around them begins to react differently. People who previously tried to control their emotions begin to encounter silent resistance. Environments that previously drained your energy cease to have the same effect. This happens because you begin to operate with constant adaptability, consciously choosing your moves on the great social chessboard. Machiavelli taught that a leader needed to possess his own loyal armies to protect his power. In modern life, these armies are invisible: discipline, self-control, and strategic clarity. And when someone builds these inner strengths, they discover something surprising. True power lies not in dominating others, but in dominating oneself. And this realization opens the way to a new way of living, freer, more strategic, and much more conscious. Now stop for a moment and think honestly. How many times in your life have you reacted immediately to something you could have simply ignored? How many times have you wasted energy trying to explain your decisions, justify your actions, or convince people who, deep down, had already decided not to understand you? Most people live trapped in this cycle. They believe they need to talk more, explain more, prove more, react more. But those who truly understand real human nature perceive something different. Respect rarely comes from persistence. Respect is born from attitude. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders needed to act with strategic intelligence, basing their decisions on politics guided by reality, not by ideals. They understood that not every battle is worth fighting, not every provocation deserves a response, and not every opinion deserves space within one's own mind. When you learn to apply silence strategically, something powerful happens. You begin to regain your energy. Start choosing your battles more carefully. It begins to act with constant adaptability, observing the game before moving its pieces. And at that moment, you notice something curious. Those who try to please everyone lose authority, but those who develop virtue, this ability to master their own reactions, begin to build a different kind of presence. A stable presence. A presence that is difficult to manage. A presence that doesn't need to prove its worth all the time. This is where true silent power emerges. Not the power to control other people, but the power of not being controlled by them. Now I want to ask you a very honest question. How many situations in your life would change if you simply reacted less and observed more? How many arguments would cease to exist? How many people would lose the power to affect their emotional state? How many decisions would then be made with greater clarity? Perhaps the transformation you seek isn't about talking more, but in learning when to remain silent. If this type of knowledge makes sense to you, then there's much more we can explore together. On this channel, we discuss strategy, human behavior, and the principles that thinkers like Machiavelli have observed throughout history. So do the following. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because in the next videos you will learn how to apply these principles to your life, your decisions, and your relationships, always basing your actions on reality and not just on nice ideas. And before you go, tell me something in the comments. Do you believe that silence can be a form of power, or do you think that those who remain silent end up being ignored? I want to read your opinion, because sometimes a simple question can be the first step for someone to start seeing the game in a completely different way.